Take one more step toward that Harley, and they'll never find what's left of you. The voice came from somewhere in the dark, low, certain the kind of voice that had buried threats before and would again. Caleb Walker didn't stop walking. I was 22 years old, covered in someone else's grease, carrying a toolbox that had more miles on it than most people's cars. He had nothing. No name, no reputation, no reason to be standing inside the most dangerous private garage in Austin, Texas. But he had heard the engine from outside, and he already knew what was wrong with it. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me until the very end. You will not see this coming. The warehouse sat at the edge of a long dirt road outside Austin, and it had no signs, no lights visible from the street, and no invitation for anyone who didn't already know it existed. The kind of place that older locals learn not to look at directly the way you don't stare at a dog that might already be deciding whether to bite. Caleb Walker had found it by sound. He'd been sleeping 3 nights in a broken-down pickup about 2 miles east, the cab barely protecting him from the kind of Texas July heat that makes the air feel like something you have to push through. He was surviving on gas station food and whatever mechanical work he could pick up at the side of the road, fixing ranchers' trucks, patching up farm equipment, once spending 6 hours underneath a rusted-out combine just to walk away with $40 and a bag of beef jerky. It was a life built entirely on necessity and instinct. But on the second night in that pickup, drifting in and out of a heat-sticky half-sleep, Caleb heard something. It was distant. It was faint. It was coming through the walls of the truck like a vibration more than a sound, a deep mechanical groan followed by a high screaming pitch that cut off too fast, like something trying to start and then something refusing to let it. He sat up straight in the dark. Most people would have heard noise. Caleb heard a story. He heard a machine in pain, an engine that knew exactly what it was supposed to do and couldn't do it, and he could tell by the pitch alone, by the particular way the scream broke apart at the top, that whatever was wrong with that engine wasn't simple. It wasn't a dead battery. It wasn't a clogged fuel line. It was something buried deep, something complicated, something that had probably been misread by every pair of hands that had tried to touch it before. He didn't go to sleep after that. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling of that truck cab, listening to the sound repeat itself twice more over the next few hours. Attempt, scream, silence. Attempt, scream, silence. Like a heartbeat that kept stopping. By morning, he had followed it on foot. The first face he saw when he stepped through the chain link opening at the side of the warehouse property was a man with a jaw like a shovel and arms that looked like they'd been built for work that had nothing to do with motorcycles. The patch on his chest was unmistakable. Everyone in Texas knew that patch. Everyone in America knew that patch. "You're on private property," the man said. "I know," Caleb said. "I heard your engine." That should have been the end of it. The man's hand moved towards something at his side that Caleb chose not to look at directly. "Heard it from where?" "About 2 miles out. Woke me up at 2 in the morning." The man stared at him for a long moment. "Nobody can hear that engine 2 miles out." "The frequency breaks at a very specific pitch," Caleb said, and he heard his own voice come out calm, matter of fact, the way it always did when he was talking about machines, because machines were the one thing in his life that had never confused him, never lied to him, never left without explanation. When it does that, it creates a subsonic wave that carries further than the bass sound, like a dog whistle in reverse. Most people can't hear the scream, but you feel it in your chest. Like something wrong. The man hadn't moved. Behind him, 3 other men had appeared in the warehouse doorway, and Caleb felt their attention land on him, the way you feel sunlight through a magnifying glass, focused, concentrated, and potentially dangerous. "Who sent you?" the man asked. "Nobody sent me," Caleb said. "Who told you about the bike?" "I told you. The engine told me." A long silence. Somewhere inside the warehouse, someone laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. The man at the gate said slowly, like he was speaking to someone who didn't fully understand the situation. "Do you know where you are right now?" "I know exactly where I am," Caleb said, "and I know what's wrong with that motorcycle. And I think you've already had a lot of people in there tell you they knew what was wrong with it and then walk away without fixing it." He paused. "I'm not going to walk away." That was the moment. He felt it before he could analyze it. A shift in the air, a slight change in the posture of the man at the gate. Not softening, not welcoming, something more careful than either of those things. The look of a man who had heard too many promises and learned to distrust all of them, but who hadn't quite found the energy to slam this particular door all the way shut. Not yet. Wait here, the man said. He disappeared inside the warehouse. Caleb stood in the heat, which was already building toward brutal, even at 8 in the morning, and he did not fidget, did not pace, did not do any of the things he might have done if he'd been thinking about his own situation. He was thinking about the engine. He was listening even now for any sound from inside, a click, a turn, a low mechanical breath. He heard footsteps instead, heavy ones, multiple sets, and then the doors of the warehouse swung wider and Marcus Iron Bennett walked out. Caleb didn't know his name yet. He learned it later. What he knew in that moment was presence, the kind that some people are born with and others spend whole lifetimes building, and Marcus had both. He was somewhere in his late 50s, built like a man who had spent 4 decades doing hard physical things and had stopped apologizing for any of it. His hair was silver gray. His eyes were the particular color of weathered steel, left out in weather it was never meant for. He looked at Caleb for a long time without speaking. Caleb looked back. He had learned early that breaking eye contact with someone who was testing you was the fastest way to lose ground you couldn't afford to lose. Raymond says you heard the bike from 2 miles out, Marcus said finally. That's right. Raymond's been riding for 30 years. He's never heard it from 2 miles out. Raymond's probably not listening for subsonic frequency breaks. Marcus tilted his head slightly. How old are you, son? 22. Where's your shop? I don't have a shop. Where's your certification? I don't have that either. A beat. Marcus looked at the toolbox in Caleb's hand. It was an old red metal Craftsman box, the corners dented, the latch repaired 3 times with different grades of wire. The kind of toolbox that looked like it had been to places most toolboxes never go. What do you have? Marcus asked. Caleb set the box down on the gravel. He opened the top tray slowly, not performing anything, just letting Marcus see what was there. Instruments. Most of them older. Some of them handmade tools, calibrated and maintained and modified in ways that no catalog sold them. I have these, Caleb said, and I have 23 years of listening to engines that other people gave up on. He paused, and I haven't given up on this one yet. Marcus looked at the tools for a long time. Then he looked up. You know what that motorcycle is worth? 2.6 million, Caleb said. I know. You know who built it? I don't. Something moved across Marcus's face. Caleb couldn't read it fully. It was too fast and too complicated, a combination of grief and anger and something older than both. The man who built it, Marcus said, is dead. He was the finest motorcycle mechanic I ever knew, and he left this project unfinished, and we have been trying to finish it for 20 years. 20 years. We have had professional engineers. We have had factory technicians from Harley Davidson itself. We have spent money that would make your head swim, and every single one of those people walked away. He said it without drama. Just facts. The weight of 20 years told in 2 sentences. Why buy? Caleb asked him. Because there's something inside of that engine, Marcus said, that nobody can figure out. Something the original builder put there that nobody else understands. Some kind of modification. Every time we get close to a solution, the engine screams and dies and we're back at zero. Caleb nodded slowly. Can I see it? Marcus studied him for another long moment. If I let you in that garage, he said, and you fail, like everyone else failed, you walk away and you don't come back. And you don't speak about what you saw in there to anyone. Are we clear? Yes. And if you try to steal anything or photograph anything, or if I find out you were sent by anyone who wants to know about this club's business. He let the sentence end itself. I understand, Caleb said. Marcus nodded, once, sharp. You've got 3 days. That was how Caleb Walker walked into the most dangerous private garage in Austin, Texas, carrying a dented red toolbox and absolutely nothing else, to attempt what 20 years and dozens of professional mechanics had failed to do. He didn't know yet what was waiting for him inside that engine. If he had known, he might have stood there in the gravel a moment longer, looking at the warehouse doors before walking through them. But he didn't know, so he walked straight in. The garage smelled the way serious mechanical spaces always smell: oil and metal and heat and time. The kind of smell that's not unpleasant if you've spent your life in it, which Caleb had. Along the walls were other bikes, some finished and gleaming, some in various states of work, but they were not what commanded the center of the room. What commanded the center of the room was the Harley. He saw it and stopped moving. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Not because of its value, though, he understood that instinctively. He stopped because of how it looked in the middle of that space, like something that had been waiting so long, it had started to take on the particular stillness of things that have given up trying to be found. Around him, the members of the chapter who had gathered to watch said nothing. He could feel their skepticism like a physical pressure. These were men who had watched every previous mechanic enter that garage with confidence and leave with defeat. They expected the same from him. Good, Caleb thought. Low expectations were the easiest kind to exceed. He walked toward the Harley, and he did not immediately open his toolbox. That was the thing that shifted something in the room. A murmur, someone asking under their breath what he was doing, someone else saying he didn't know. Caleb put his hand on the engine. Not the way a mechanic checking for heat puts their hand on an engine. He pressed his palm flat against the casing, closed his eyes, and held still. The men watching him exchanged looks. A few of them shifted uncomfortably. A larger man with a dark beard muttered something about the kid being crazy. Caleb wasn't being theatrical. He was listening. His hand was his most accurate instrument, more accurate in some ways than anything in his toolbox, because he had been doing this since he was 4 years old, pressing his small hand against the engines his father worked on in the garage of a house he barely remembered anymore. Feeling the mechanical heartbeat translate through metal and skin and into something his brain cataloged automatically. He felt the Harley's stillness, and even in stillness, machines speak. The casting was cold, but he could feel imperfections in the surface finish that told him something had been done by hand at a level of care that was extraordinary. This wasn't factory work. This was personal. Every modification on this engine, and he could already tell there were many, had been made by someone who thought about it the way an artist thinks about a painting. Not as a technical problem, as an expression. "Go ahead and start it," he said without opening his eyes. No one moved. "Start the engine," he said again. Marcus nodded at someone, and Raymond, the man from the gate, climbed onto the Harley. He turned the key. He engaged the starter. The engine caught. For about 3 seconds, it ran beautifully, a sound that was rich and deep and almost musical. A mechanical voice so precisely engineered that even the doubters in the room went slightly still. For 3 seconds, you could hear what this motorcycle was supposed to be. Then the scream. It started at the mid-range and climbed fast, a rising pitch that had something mechanical and something almost anguished in it, and then it cut off and the engine died. Silence. The old silence that everyone in that room had heard too many times. "Again," Caleb said. Raymond looked at Marcus. Marcus nodded again. Again. Scream, silence. Again. This time, as the engine caught and climbed toward the scream, Caleb moved his hand along the casing in 3 specific directions, tracking the vibration, following it, like a river back to its source. And then the engine died again, and Caleb opened his eyes and he looked directly at Marcus. "The previous mechanics," he said, "what were they looking for when they tried to fix this?" "What do you mean, what were they looking for?" "I mean, what was their diagnostic approach? What were they identifying as the problem?" Marcus crossed his arms. "Fuel system, ignition timing, compression issues, valve clearance, all of it. And when they fixed those things, the engine still screamed and died." "Because that's not where the problem is," Caleb said. A man near the wall, older, heavyset, with hands that looked like they'd never fully come clean from a lifetime of grease, made a sound that was half laugh and half contempt. "Kid, we've had engineers from Milwaukee Harley's own people tell us they couldn't crack it. And you're going to stand there for 3 minutes and say, you know." "No," Caleb said, turning to look at him. "I'm going to stand here and say, I know where to look. Those are 2 different things." The man stared at him. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. The man straightened slightly. "Frank." Caleb held his gaze for a moment, just a moment, and then he turned back to the Harley. There was something about Frank. He filed it away without being sure why. He opened his toolbox and began taking out instruments. A vibration sensor calibrated by hand, a set of custom frequency analyzers he'd built from components he'd salvaged across 3 states, an optical scope so fine it could read the finish on a machine surface to a tolerance most shops couldn't match. Over the next 6 hours, Caleb did not rest and did not speak much. He worked, and the men watched him, and at some point they stopped watching with skepticism and started watching with a different kind of attention. The attention you give to something you don't understand but can't look away from. He moved around the engine with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who had nothing to rush toward, no deadline that mattered more than the work. He found the first unusual modification at hour 2. It was in the ignition system, a secondary circuit that shouldn't have been there, wired in parallel with the main ignition in a configuration he had never seen before, but which once he saw it made a particular kind of elegant sense. It was designed to create a harmonic interaction between the ignition pulse and the fuel injection cycle. The effect, when it worked correctly, would be an engine that ran in a kind of musical synchronicity, every component amplifying every other component in a resonance pattern that would produce that extraordinary sound he'd heard for 3 seconds before the scream. He sat back on his heels and stared at it for a long time. "Someone want to bring me some light," he said. Raymond came over with a work lamp. Caleb pointed at the secondary circuit. Raymond looked at it. His expression changed. "What is that?" Raymond said quietly. "Something custom," Caleb said. "Something designed specifically for this engine. Has anyone else found this?" Raymond straightened up. "Nobody mentioned it." "Nobody found it," Caleb said. He was already reaching for the optical scope. "Because it's hidden, deliberately, behind the factory casing." He paused. This was designed to be hard to find. He moved the scope further along the circuit, following it to its terminal point, and that was where the light caught something he had not expected. Scratched into the metal, tiny but precise, the kind of deliberate marking made by someone who wanted to ensure it would be read by the right person letters. A name. He pulled the scope back. He read it again. He lowered the scope slowly. "What is it?" Raymond asked. Caleb looked up. Across the room, Marcus had been watching. Something in Caleb's expression had changed, and Marcus had noticed. And now the older man was walking toward him with a purposefulness that suggested he had learned over the years that when someone's face changes during a job, you needed to know why immediately. "What did you find?" Marcus said. Caleb looked at the name scratched in the metal. He looked at Marcus. "Who built this motorcycle?" he asked. His voice came out differently than he intended, lower, rougher, like something in his throat had tightened. "I told you," Marcus said. "A mechanic, a friend of mine. He passed away 20 years ago." "What was his name?" Caleb said. And something in the way he asked it made Marcus go very still. "Thomas," Marcus said carefully. "Thomas Walker." The room around them continued its ordinary sounds, the shift of weight on the concrete floor, the distant traffic outside, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Caleb Walker heard none of it. His father's name inside a machine he had heard from 2 miles away, on a road that had no reason to bring him here, in a life that had given him nothing to hold on to. His father's name. He set down the optical scope with a hand that was not entirely steady. "Excuse me," he said, and stood up and walked to the far corner of the garage and stood there with his back to the room for 45 seconds. When he turned back around, his face was composed. But Marcus Bennett was watching him with an expression that had passed beyond simple caution into something much more careful than that, the expression of a man who had just watched something click into place that he did not yet fully understand, but recognized instinctively as important. "Thomas Walker," Marcus said slowly. "That was his name. Did you know him?" Caleb walked back toward the motorcycle. He picked up the optical scope. He looked back at the name scratched into the metal T. "Walker," and he breathed in slowly and breathed out slowly and told himself what he always told himself when the world outside the machine tried to pull him off his axis. "Focus on the work. Find what's broken. Fix what's there." "I need to see all the documentation from the previous repairs," Caleb said. "Every report, every technician's notes, everything." Marcus stared at him for another moment. "Did you know Thomas Walker?" Caleb set the scope down gently. "He was my father," he said. "I hadn't heard his name in 18 years. The garage went absolutely silent. Not the mechanical silence of an engine that has stopped, but the human silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that rewrites the shape of everything that came before it. Marcus Bennett's face did something complicated that Caleb couldn't fully read from across the space between them. grief and recognition, and something that might have been the beginning of a decision. Frank across the room had gone completely still, and somewhere underneath the silence, somewhere underneath the weight of 20 years and a dead man's name scratched into metal, the Harley Davidson sat in the middle of the floor patient, as it had always been patient, waiting for the one person it had been built to wait for. It had been 20 years. It could wait a few more hours. But Caleb Walker, standing in the garage with a scope in his hand and a name he had not spoken aloud since he was a small boy, was beginning to understand that he had not stumbled onto this road by accident, that the sound he had heard from 2 miles away, the engine cry that had pulled him out of sleep and across a dirt road in Texas July, heat had not been random. His father had built something that only a walker could hear, and he had left a message inside it. The only question now was what that message said and whether the men in this room would let Caleb stay long enough to read it. He picked up the optical scope again. He went back to work, and Frank Miller across the garage watched him with eyes that had gone from contempt to something much more complicated, something that looked, if you studied it closely, less like anger and more like fear. The engine waited. The truth waited. And somewhere inside the wiring of a 20-year-old ghost's finest work, a message was about to change everything. Anyone in that room thought they knew about the past. The silence in that garage lasted exactly 4 seconds. Caleb counted them without meaning, to the way you count things when your brain is trying to buy itself time to process something it wasn't prepared for. 4 seconds of absolute stillness from men who were not by nature or reputation the kind of men who went still easily. Then Marcus Bennett said very quietly, "Say that again." Caleb did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the engine, kept his hand on the casing, kept his breathing level, the way he had trained himself to do in situations where falling apart was not an option he could afford. "Thomas Walker," he said. "He was my father." Another pause, shorter this time. "Thomas Walker did not have a son," Marcus said. His voice had dropped into a register that was not aggressive but was absolute. The voice of a man stating something he knew to be true because he had believed it for 20 years. "Thomas never mentioned a child, not once." Caleb turned around then. "That doesn't surprise me," he said. And he meant it without bitterness, because he had spent enough years living in the space that bitterness occupied to know that it didn't make anything cleaner or clearer. "He left when I was 4. I don't know why. I never had the chance to ask him." Marcus looked at him for a long time. The kind of look that is actually a calculation, a man measuring something, weighing it against what he thought he already knew, looking for the seam between truth and performance. "How long have you known your father was dead?" Marcus asked. "I didn't know," Caleb said, "until about 90 seconds ago." The room absorbed that. Raymond, standing to Caleb's left with the work lamp still in his hand, exhaled slowly. He looked at Marcus, then at the Harley, then at Caleb, and in his expression was the particular kind of discomfort that comes from suddenly realizing that a situation you thought you understood has a dimension you hadn't accounted for. Frank Miller across the room said nothing. He had not moved since Caleb said the name aloud, and he stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw set in a way that looked less like composure and more like a man holding a wall up from the inside. "You came here by accident," Marcus said. It wasn't quite a question. "I heard the engine," Caleb said. "From 2 miles out, I have followed the sound." Marcus turned to look at the Harley for a moment. Something moved across his face that Caleb couldn't fully classify. It was the expression of a man standing at the intersection of 20 years of grief, and something that felt unsettlingly like the hand of something larger than coincidence. "Thomas used to say," Marcus said slowly, "that the engine he was building would speak to the right person. We all thought he was being poetic." He paused. Thomas was often poetic. "What was he like?" Caleb asked. He didn't plan to ask it. It came out the way things come out when the guard you've spent years building has a crack in it, and something gets through the crack before you can close it. He heard his own voice asking and felt the particular vulnerability of the question land in his chest and stay there. Marcus studied him. "How was brilliant," Marcus said finally. "He was the best mechanic I have ever known, and I have known many. He could hear an engine the way a musician hears a wrong note. Not just that something was wrong, but exactly what it was and why, and what it would take to fix it." He paused again, and something in his expression shifted harder, now more careful. He was also not an easy man to know. He kept things close. He carried things he never talked about. "Things like a son he left behind," Caleb said. Marcus didn't answer that directly, but he didn't deny it either. What I can tell you, Marcus said, is that Thomas Walker came to us 17 years ago. He had nothing when he arrived, no shop, no reputation here, just his tools and his ability. And over time, he became family. He spent the last 3 years of his life building that motorcycle. He gestured at the Harley. He said it was his masterpiece. He said there was a reason he was building it, but he never told any of us what the reason was. He died of a heart attack before he could finish it. 49 years old. Caleb looked at the Harley. His father had been 49 years old. He was 22 now. The math was simple and brutal. His father had left when Caleb was 4, which meant Thomas Walker had spent 18 years living a life that had no Caleb in it, building a motorcycle for a reason he never explained to anyone and dying before he could tell anyone what that reason was, except that he had left a name inside the engine and an instruction. I need to keep working, Caleb said. You need to answer some questions first, Marcus said, and there was a firmness in it that reminded Caleb that whatever this moment was personally, he was still in a room with men who had let him through their gate based on a story about hearing an engine from 2 miles out, and that the discovery of his father's name in their unfinished machine did not automatically make him trusted. Ask them, Caleb said. Do you have any proof that Thomas Walker was your father? Caleb set down the optical scope. He reached into the front pocket of his work jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet that was held together by habit more than integrity. From inside it, he withdrew a photograph. Small crease, the color faded in the way photographs fade when they've been handled too many times in too many different light conditions. He held it out to Marcus. Marcus took it. He looked at it. His expression changed in a way that was immediate and unmistakable, the involuntary response of a face that recognizes something before the mind can construct a careful reaction. Where did you get this? Marcus said. My mother kept it, Caleb said. She gave it to me when I was 16 and told me that was the only picture she had of my father, and she didn't want to keep it anymore. She wasn't cruel about it. She was done carrying it. Marcus turned the photograph so Raymond could see it. Raymond's eyebrows went up. He looked at Caleb, then at the photograph, then at Caleb again. That's Thomas, Raymond said quietly. Maybe 25, 26 years old. He paused, and the woman next to him. My mother, Caleb said. Before I was born, or just after, I was never sure. Marcus handed the photograph back carefully. He was quiet for a long moment, and in the quiet, you could hear the weight of 20 years of a secret that Thomas Walker had apparently carried alone. He never told us he had a family, Marcus said. I don't know what he told you, Caleb said. I just know what he left me. Marcus looked at him sharply. What do you mean what he left you? Caleb turned back to the motorcycle. He pointed at the engine compartment at the spot where the optical scope had revealed the secondary circuit and the name scratched into the metal. There's more than a name in there, Caleb said. The secondary circuit, I found the hidden ignition modification. It's not complete. It's the first layer of something. I think there are more layers. I think the entire engine has been designed as a kind of message hidden inside a machine that only someone who understood his specific approach to harmonic engineering would be able to read. He paused. He designed this for someone who thinks the way he thought. For you, Raymond said. I don't know that yet, Caleb said carefully, but I'm the only one who's been able to find any of it, so let me keep looking. Marcus looked at him for one more long moment. Then he made a decision that Caleb could see being made a physical, settling, a choice being committed to. Keep working, Marcus said. Caleb picked up the optical scope and went back to the engine, and for a while the garage returned to its working silence, and the men who had gathered to watch a young mechanic fail at something everyone else had failed at settled back into the particular watchful stillness of people who have decided to wait and see. But Frank Miller walked out of the garage. Nobody mentioned it, but Caleb noticed. He noticed because he had filed Frank away at the beginning of that first moment of contempt followed by the too fast stillness when Thomas's name was said aloud, and now the departure, not casual, not the departure of a man who had somewhere to be, but the departure of a man who needed to be somewhere other than here immediately for reasons that had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with the name. Caleb kept his eyes on the engine, but a part of his brain, the part that had spent 22 years surviving by reading environments, accurately had moved Frank Miller from a background figure to a foreground one. He would come back to Frank. For now, there was the engine. The secondary circuit led him to a second modification at hour 4, a fuel delivery system that had been altered at the injector level in a way that should theoretically have made the fuel-air mixture more efficient, but which interacted with the secondary ignition circuit in a way that created the problem. The scream, the death. But not because the modification was wrong, because it was incomplete. Caleb stared at the incomplete fuel modification for a long time, his hands resting on his knees, his mind running the calculations the way his mind always ran them visually, spatially, a three-dimensional model of mechanical interaction built entirely inside his head. His father had started something here and not finished it. The question was whether Thomas Walker had failed to finish it because he ran out of time, or whether he had left it intentionally incomplete, the way you leave a sentence unfinished when you want someone to complete it for you. Raymond, Caleb said. Raymond came over. The technicians who worked on this before me, did any of them find this fuel modification? Raymond thought about it. One did. About 8 years ago, an engineer from California said he could see that the injection system had been changed, but couldn't figure out what it was supposed to do. What did he do with it? He left it alone, said it was too custom, too risky to modify without understanding the original intent. That was the right call, Caleb said. He just didn't know what the intent was. And you do. Caleb sat back. I think so, he said. I think the fuel modification is the second part of a three-part system. The first part is the ignition circuit. The third part, he looked at the engine. I haven't found it yet. What does the third part do? Caleb didn't answer immediately. He was listening again, his hand back on the casing, his eyes unfocused in the way they went unfocused when he was running the model in his head and needed his visual field to get out of the way. The third part, he said slowly, is what makes it sing. Raymond stared at him. You mean the sound we heard for 3 seconds when you first started it? That sound sustained, not 3 seconds, continuously. The way he designed it to run. Caleb looked up. This engine, when all 3 systems are working together and correctly completed, is going to produce a sound that no production motorcycle has ever made. Your friend wasn't just building a custom bike. He was building an instrument. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He used to say that, he said softly. Thomas. He used to say he was building something that would make people stop whatever they were doing and just listen. Caleb stood up. He looked at the Harley with something that had moved past professional assessment into something more personal, more complicated, the way you look at something when you begin to understand that it carries a meaning that was intended for you. Where are Thomas's personal effects, Caleb said. Anything he left behind. Tools, notebooks, anything. Raymond looked at Marcus, who had been listening from near the wall. Marcus pushed off the wall and walked toward a door at the back of the garage. Come with me, he said. The room Thomas Walker had used as a private workshop was small and had not been changed since the day he died. Marcus explained this without being asked that they had argued about it. Some members wanting to clear the space and use it, others refusing, and the refusers had won, which said something about how Thomas Walker had been regarded in this place. Caleb walked in and stopped. The walls were covered in notes. Not typed, not printed, handwritten in a compact and precise script that covered every available surface, interspersed with diagrams and calculations in small detailed drawings of engine components. His father's handwriting. He had never seen his father's handwriting before. He hadn't known what it would look like. But looking at it now, precise, dense, the handwriting of someone who thought faster than they wrote and had learned to compress their thought accordingly, Caleb felt something shift in his chest that he could not fully name. It looked like the way Caleb thought. He walked closer to the wall and read without speaking for several minutes, and Marcus stood in the doorway and let him read. The notes covered the 3-system theory that Caleb had already begun to deduce from the engine itself, the ignition circuit, the fuel modification, and a third system described in the notes as the resonance chamber, a modification to the exhaust system designed to create a specific harmonic frequency that would interact with the first 2 systems to produce the sustained musical tone. But there was something else in the notes. Caleb found it on the back wall behind a shelf that had partially obscured it. A section of notes that was different from the rest, not technical, not diagrams, not calculations. Words. Sentences. The handwriting was the same, but the pressure was different, heavier. The kind of pressure that comes from writing something that costs you something. He leaned in and read. He read it twice. Then he straightened up slowly and stood very still for a moment. Marcus, he said, yeah. How did my father die? You said a heart attack. That's right. In this garage. He was working late alone. Raymond found him in the morning. Was there any question about it? About the cause? A pause that was half a second too long. What kind of question? Marcus said carefully. Caleb turned around. The kind you're already thinking about based on the way you just answered me. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. He was not a man accustomed to being read that precisely by someone he had known for less than a day. There was no official question, Marcus said. The medical examiner ruled it a natural death. But inside this chapter, Caleb said, there was a question. Silence. There were people, Marcus said finally, who felt that Thomas had enemies, within and outside this chapter. People who might have had reasons to want that engine never finished. But we had no evidence, nothing concrete. And Thomas was gone, and the official ruling was what it was. He paused. We moved on, because that's what you do. Caleb looked back at the wall, at the words his father had written in heavy-pressured ink on the back of a wall in a room that hadn't been touched in 20 years. The words said, if something happens to me before this is finished, the answer is inside the third system. Don't let them take it apart. The right person will find it. He'll know what to listen for. The right person will find it. He'll know what to listen for. Caleb stood in the middle of his dead father's private workshop, surrounded by 20 years of his father's handwriting, and understood that the road that had brought him here, the 2-mile dirt road he had walked in Texas July heat following a sound that most people couldn't hear, had not been random at all. His father had built a frequency that only his son could follow home. Marcus, Caleb said, his voice was steady. He had decided to be steady. I need you to tell me everything you know about why someone inside this chapter might have wanted this motorcycle destroyed. Marcus pushed off the door frame and stood fully upright. That's a serious question, Marcus said. I know. It's the kind of question that changes things. Once you ask it out loud and I answer it, we're in different territory than we've been in. I know that too, Caleb said. Ask yourself this, if my father left a message in that engine saying the answer is inside the third system, and someone has been preventing anyone from finding the third system for 20 years, what does that tell you? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. It tells me, he said slowly, that whoever has been preventing it knows what the third system contains. Yes, Caleb said. Another silence. Longer. Frank Miller, Marcus said. Not a question. The way you say a name when it has been waiting in the back of your mind for longer than you've admitted. He walked out when I said my father's name, Caleb said. He was the only one. Frank was Thomas's closest friend, Marcus said, for years. And then something happened between them about a year before Thomas died. They stopped speaking. Nobody knew why. Thomas wouldn't talk about it. Frank wouldn't talk about it. And after Thomas died, Frank was the first one to argue for dismantling the motorcycle. Marcus's voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of a man following a trail of implications he hadn't wanted to follow. He said it was a money pit, said Thomas would have wanted it used for parts rather than sitting as a monument. He was outvoted, but he argued for it hard. Every time a mechanic came close to the third system, Caleb started. The bike failed, Marcus finished. He stopped. He said it again more quietly. The bike failed every time, without exception. He looked at Caleb. I always assumed that was the mechanical problem, that we were accidentally triggering some cascading failure in the system. Or, Caleb said, someone who knew where the third system was located was making sure no one found it. The weight of 20 years settled into the room and became something specific, something with a name and a face and a patch on its chest. Marcus's expression was doing several things at once. Anger, grief, disbelief, fighting with belief, the particular pain of a man beginning to understand that something he trusted had been wrong for longer than he could easily account for. I need to see Frank, Marcus said. Not yet, Caleb said. If you confront him now before I find the third system and understand what's in it, you give him the chance to destroy it. Whatever the message in that system is, whatever my father left in there, Frank knows what it is, and if he knows we're coming for it, it's gone. Marcus stared at him. You're 22 years old, he said. Yes, Caleb said, and you're telling me how to handle a situation inside my own chapter. I'm telling you how to protect something your friend spent the last years of his life building, Caleb said. I think that's different. Another long pause. Marcus looked at the walls covered in Thomas's handwriting. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the photograph Caleb had shown him earlier, the faded image of a young Thomas Walker, standing next to a woman before the years that came after, before the secrets and the silence and the midnight death in a garage. How long do you need, Marcus said, to find the third system? 12 hours, maybe less. And what do you do when you find it? Caleb looked at the words on the back wall one more time. The right person will find it. He'll know what to listen for. I finished what he started, Caleb said, and then we find out what he was trying to say. Marcus nodded. Once. The same sharp nod he had given at the gate when he told Caleb he had 3 days, except this one carried something heavier. Not just permission, but trust, the kind that costs something to give. 12 hours, Marcus said. And Caleb, he stopped. Yeah. If you're right about Frank, if what you're suggesting is what it looks like. He paused again, and in the pause was everything a man carries when he finds out that loyalty was used against him. I need you to be sure. I will be, Caleb said. The engine will tell me. He walked back out into the main garage and looked at the Harley for a long moment. Somewhere on that machine, hidden in the exhaust system, was the third modification his father had built. The resonance chamber. The piece that made it sing. And inside it, if Thomas Walker had done what Caleb now believed he had done, was the proof of whatever had happened in the year before he died, and the reason someone had spent 20 years making sure it was never found. Caleb picked up his tools. He had 12 hours. He started with the exhaust. The first hour produced nothing unusual. The exhaust system appeared standard. At first looked stock enough that anyone doing a cursory examination would have moved on. But Caleb did not do cursory examinations. He worked millimeter by millimeter, running his sensor along every weld and joint and connection, listening for variations in density, feeling for differences in the surface quality of the metal that would indicate secondary work. He found it at hour 2. It was inside the secondary exhaust pipe, a chamber within the pipe, accessible only from an angle that required disassembling a component that no mechanic working on an ignition or fuel system would have any reason to disassemble. A false wall inside the pipe, expertly welded, invisible from the outside, discoverable only if you were looking for it specifically, or if you disassembled the exhaust system entirely for reasons unrelated to the problem mechanics had been trying to solve. The chamber was the resonance modification his father had described in the notes. The engineering of it was extraordinary. Caleb could see immediately, even before fully understanding the system, that it was the work of someone operating at a level of craft that was genuinely rare. The kind of work that justified calling something a masterpiece. But the chamber was not empty. Caleb reached inside with a thin retrieval instrument and felt something that was not metal. He worked it out carefully and held it in the garage light. A small tube sealed with a wax cap. Inside the tube, rolled tight, was a piece of paper. His hands were not steady when he opened it. The garage was mostly empty. Marcus had cleared it down to Raymond and 2 others he trusted, following Caleb's instruction to keep the discovery quiet until they knew what they were dealing with. Those 3 men watched Caleb unfold the paper. He read it. He read it twice because the first time his brain refused to fully process what it was seeing. Then he looked up at Marcus. Your friend didn't die of a heart attack, Caleb said. The words landed in the garage like something physical. Raymond made a sound. Marcus went very still. The stillness that is not calm, but is the thing your body does in the moment before calm is no longer an option. What does it say? Marcus said. His voice was rock steady. The steadiness of a man who has been trained by decades of hard living to keep his voice steady when everything else is collapsing. Caleb looked at the paper again. It says, he read carefully, that in the 6 months before he died, Thomas Walker discovered that someone inside this chapter had been informing on the club's activities to outside interests, that he had evidence, that he had confronted the person directly, and that 2 weeks after that confrontation, he wrote this note and sealed it inside the engine because he believed something was going to happen to him and he needed the evidence to survive him. Complete silence. He also says, Caleb continued, his voice lower now, because the next part was the part that landed differently, that he was sorry, that there was a son he had left behind a long time ago, and that every year he told himself he would go back and explain, and every year he didn't because he was afraid the son would not want to see him, that he was afraid he had destroyed something that couldn't be repaired, that the motorcycle was the only way he knew to say what he couldn't make himself say in person. Caleb stopped reading. He folded the paper carefully. The garage was absolutely silent. Marcus Bennett, leader of the Austin chapter, a man who had ridden through 4 decades of things that should have broken him and hadn't put one hand on the side of the Harley and stood there with his head down for a moment that stretched long enough to feel private. Then he straightened up. He looked at Caleb. His eyes were dry, but barely. "Where's the evidence?" he said. "The evidence Thomas said he had." "It's in here too," Caleb said. He reached back into the chamber and withdrew a second sealed tube smaller than the first. Inside it was a folded piece of paper that was not a letter but a list, dates, amounts, names. The kind of record a careful man keeps when he knows the information is dangerous enough to get him killed. At the top of the list, in the same compressed handwriting that covered every wall in the back room, was a single name: Frank Miller. Marcus read it. He read it for a long time, long enough that Raymond leaned over to see, and Raymond's face went through something that moved from disbelief to grief to a particular kind of anger that had nowhere comfortable to go. 20 years, Marcus said quietly. Not to Caleb, not to Raymond, to himself or to Thomas, or to the 20 years that Frank Miller had spent standing in this chapter and watching mechanics fail and voting to dismantle the machine and carrying his guilt so well that no one had seen it. "What do you want to do?" Caleb said. Marcus looked at him for a moment. This young man he had known for less than a day, this son of a dead friend, this mechanic who had walked in from the road with a dented toolbox and no credentials, and had found in 12 hours what 20 years had buried. "I want you to finish the motorcycle," Marcus said, "and then I'll handle Frank." Caleb looked at the exhaust system. At the resonance chamber his father had engineered inside the pipe, the third modification, the piece that completed the three-part system, the voice of the instrument his father had spent his final years building. It wasn't done. It was designed and installed, but not completed the same intentional incompleteness as the first two systems, the fingerprints of a man who had designed a restoration that required someone else to finish it, required specifically the right person. Caleb picked up his tools. He understood now what the third system needed because he had built the model in his head from the first two systems, and the third was the completion of a logic that his own mind had been following since he first pressed his hand against the engine and felt the particular quality of his father's work speaking to him through the metal. He worked through the night. Marcus brought him coffee without being asked. Raymond stayed close but didn't talk, respecting the particular silence that serious work requires. The other two members took positions near the door and outside Frank Miller's bike, sat in the parking area, and Frank presumably sat somewhere, not knowing that in the garage he had spent 20 years visiting the machine. He had spent 20 years preventing from being completed, was finally hour by hour being brought alive. By 4 in the morning, Caleb had completed the third modification. He sat back on his heels and looked at the Harley and breathed. "Ready?" Raymond asked. Caleb stood up. He was exhausted in the specific way you are exhausted when your body has been working and your mind has been working and your heart has been working simultaneously for hours without rest and exhaustion, sits somewhere deeper than tired. "Get everyone," Caleb said, "including Frank." Marcus looked at him. "Including Frank," Caleb said again. "I want him to hear this." And Marcus went to get the chapter, and Caleb stood alone in the garage for a moment with his father's motorcycle, his hand resting on the engine one more time, and said the only thing he could think to say to a man he had never known and would never meet. "Okay," he said quietly, "let's see what you built." They came in one by one the way men come into a space when they've been told something is about to happen but haven't been told what. Some of them had been sleeping. Some of them hadn't. You could tell by looking. The ones who had been sleeping wore the loose, unguarded expressions of people pulled back from rest before they were ready, and the ones who hadn't slept wore the tight-jawed look of men who had been sitting with something that wouldn't let them lie down. Frank Miller walked in last. Caleb watched him from across the garage without making it obvious he was watching. Frank moved the way a man moves when he is performing normalcy, every step slightly too deliberate, the body doing the mechanical work of casual while the mind is running calculations behind the eyes. He found a position near the back wall and leaned against it with his arms crossed and his face arranged into an expression of mild, patient skepticism, the same expression he had worn when Caleb first walked into this garage 18 hours ago. But the arms were too tight. The jaw was too still. Frank Miller was afraid, and he was working very hard to make sure nobody could see it. Caleb turned back to the Harley. 12 members of the Austin chapter were now arranged around the motorcycle in a loose half circle, and the garage had the particular charged quality of a room where everyone present knows they are about to witness something, but nobody knows yet whether it will be triumph or another defeat. 20 years of failed attempts lived in the air alongside the smell of oil and metal. And even the men who had most recently joined the chapter and had no personal memory of Thomas Walker had been told the story enough times that they felt the weight of it. Marcus stood at the front of the half circle to Caleb's right. He had not looked at Frank since the members assembled. Caleb had asked him specifically to hold that back, to wait to let the engine speak first, and Marcus was holding to it with the discipline of a man who had made a promise and understood exactly how much it was costing him to keep it. Raymond stood nearest to Caleb, close enough to hand him anything he needed, which was the role he had quietly assumed over the course of the night, without being asked and without needing to be asked. Caleb appreciated that about Raymond. He read situations accurately and acted on what he read without requiring instruction. "Before I start it," Caleb said, and the room went immediately quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they've been waiting for the person at the center to speak. "I want to tell you something about this motorcycle, about what it is." I was not a natural speaker. He had spent most of his life alone or working, or both, and the kind of easy social fluency that comes from years of being around people was not something he had developed. But he had learned in the years of moving from place to place and job to job and garage to garage that when you needed to say something true, the words didn't have to be elegant. They just had to be honest. Thomas Walker was building an instrument, Caleb said. Not a motorcycle that happened to sound good. An actual instrument, an engineered piece of music. Every modification he put into this machine was designed to interact with every other modification to produce a specific harmonic output. The ignition circuit, the fuel injection system, the resonance chamber in the exhaust, there are three movements in the same composition. He paused. He was a genius. I want you to know that before you hear it. Whatever you thought about this motorcycle before tonight, I want you to understand that what your friend built here is something that should not have been possible to build. The room was still. Somewhere near the back, someone made a sound that was not quite a word. He didn't finish it, Caleb continued. He designed all three systems and installed them, but he left each one incomplete in a specific way. A way that required someone who understood his logic to complete it. He stopped for a moment. I completed all three systems tonight. What you're about to hear is the motorcycle your friend intended to build. The one he spent the last years of his life trying to finish. He looked at Marcus for just a moment. Marcus gave him the sharp nod. Caleb turned to the Harley, climbed on, and turned the key. The engine caught. The first 3 seconds were the same 3 seconds everyone in the room had heard before, that extraordinary, almost unbearable richness of sound that had tormented them for 20 years by appearing and then disappearing before it could be held. The sound that was so close to something perfect that its loss was worse than silence would have been. Several people in the room visibly tensed. They knew what came next. They had heard it come next for 2 decades. The body learns to brace for disappointment the way it learns to brace for a familiar pain, involuntarily ahead of the event. The muscles contracting before the mind has consciously processed the threat. The scream began to build, and then something different happened. Caleb didn't fight it. He didn't adjust the throttle or cut the ignition or do any of the things every previous mechanic had done when the frequency climbed toward its breaking point. He listened to it build the way he had listened to it build a dozen times in the past 18 hours, and at the precise moment when the sound reached the threshold where it had always broken apart before he made a single, very small adjustment, not to the engine, not to the fuel, not to anything mechanical, but to the throttle position, changing the intake volume by a percentage so small that it was less an action than a suggestion. The scream hung at the threshold for 1 second, 2 seconds, and then it resolved. Not into silence, not into the mechanical death that had ended every previous attempt. It resolved downward, the frequency dropping from its breaking point into a lower register that was rich and sustained and harmonic, and then the three systems found each other. The ignition circuit, in the fuel modification, and in the resonance chamber all arrived at the same moment at the configuration Thomas Walker had designed them to reach in the Harley sang. There was no other word for it. It was not an engine sound. It was not the sound any motorcycle made or had made or arguably should have been able to make. It was a sustained, full-bodied note that seemed to come from everywhere in the room simultaneously, that moved through the chest of everyone present. The way music moves through the body rather than simply through the ears, a sound that bypassed the analytical brain entirely and arrived directly at something older and more fundamental. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Men who had ridden hard for 30 and 40 years, men who had heard every configuration of engine sound that existed, stood frozen in the garage with expressions on their faces that none of them would have been comfortable describing out loud. Raymond had his hand over his mouth. Marcus Bennett stood with his eyes closed. The Harley sang. It sang for 60 seconds, 90 seconds, 2 full minutes, sustained perfect, exactly what Thomas Walker had heard in his mind when he designed it and had never lived to hear from the outside. Caleb let it run. Then slowly he eased the throttle back and let the engine settle into idle. And the song became a purr, and the purr was also beautiful, but differently the beauty of a thing at rest, rather than a thing expressing itself fully. He turned the key. The engine stopped. And for a very long moment, there was nothing in the garage but the breathing of 12 men who had just heard something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe to people who hadn't been there. Marcus opened his eyes. He looked at the Harley. He looked at Caleb. His face was doing things that a face like his, built by decades into something that expressed very little involuntarily, was not accustomed to doing in front of a room full of people. Thomas, he said, just the name, quietly. To no one in particular, or to the air, or to 20 years of a friend who wasn't there to hear it. And that was when Frank Miller pushed off the wall and headed for the door. He moved fast, not run, but the walking pace of a man who has calculated that he has a small window and is determined to use it before it closes. He had his hand on the side door before anyone reacted, and he might have gotten through it if Raymond hadn't been faster than his build suggested, crossing the space in 3 steps and putting his palm flat against the door above Frank's head. Frank stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. Frank, Marcus said. The single word carried everything. 20 years of friendship, 20 years of trust, and now the particular weight of what that trust had been worth. Frank turned around. He looked at Marcus and then at Caleb, and the performance of normalcy he had been maintaining for the past hour finally stopped working. What replaced it was not guilt exactly and not defiance exactly. It was something older and more exhausted than either of those things, the face of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and whose body has finally stopped pretending it isn't heavy. You found it, Frank said, not to Marcus, to Caleb. I found it, Caleb said. Frank looked at the Harley. He looked at it the way you look at something you've been afraid of for 20 years, the fear and the grief so tangled together at this point that it was probably impossible even for him to separate them. He told you to play it first, Frank said. It was almost an accusation. Before you confronted me, he knew you'd play it first. I didn't, Caleb started. Not you, Frank said. Thomas. He let out a breath. He knew me better than I knew myself. He knew it. I wouldn't be able to walk out after hearing it. He paused. He knew I'd want to hear it, even after everything. He knew I wouldn't be able to leave before I heard it. The room was very still. Sit down, Frank, Marcus said. Frank looked at him for a moment, the look of a man measuring whether there is any version of this that ends differently than the version he can see clearly in front of him. There wasn't. He sat down on a workbench against the wall. Marcus pulled a stool in front of him and sat down close enough that this was a conversation between 2 men and not a confrontation with an audience, though the audience was there and everyone knew it. Tell me, Marcus said. His voice had no anger in it. That was somehow worse than anger would have been. Frank put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were dry, but the skin around them was tight with the effort of keeping them that way. It started before Thomas died, Frank said. 3 years before. You remember what things were like then? The chapter was in trouble. Real trouble. Financially, legally. There was pressure from outside that we weren't handling well, and everybody knew it. He paused. I was approached by someone who said they could make the legal problems go away in exchange for information. What kind of information, Marcus said. Flat, no inflection. Operations, routes. Nothing that would get anyone killed, that's what they told me. Low-level intelligence, they said. We cooperate on some things, they look the other way on others. Frank's voice was steady but mechanical, the steadiness of someone who has been over this terrain so many times in their own head that they can narrate it without fully inhabiting it. I told myself it was temporary, that I was protecting the chapter, that the alternative was worse. And Thomas found out, Marcus said. Thomas found out. Frank said it like a period at the end of a very long sentence. He confronted me 6 months before he died. Private, just us. He gave me the chance to come forward myself. He said he would stand with me. When I did that, he would advocate for. He stopped. He started again. He was trying to protect me. Even then, even after what I'd done. But you didn't come forward, Marcus said. I panicked, Frank said. He said it simply without decoration. I had been doing it for 3 years by then. It wasn't small anymore. It had gotten the information I was providing, had gotten more significant over time. The way those things do the way they always do, they ask for a little more and then a little more. And by the time Thomas found out what I had done was not something I could stand up in front of this room and survive. So you let Thomas die, Marcus said. Frank flinched, a real flinch, not performed the physical response of someone who has just heard the thing they have carried the longest, said out loud in the plainest possible language. I did not, Frank said, and for the first time his voice had heat in it. Have Thomas killed. I want to be clear about that. I didn't order it. I didn't ask for it. When it happened, he stopped. His breathing changed. When it happened, I did not know it was going to happen. And when it did happen, I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself his heart was bad. Everyone knew his heart was bad, that it had nothing to do with me or what I told them. But you didn't believe that, Caleb said. Frank looked at him. The look was complicated. There was no hostility in it now, which was stranger in some ways than hostility would have been. Looking at Caleb seemed to do something to Frank that looked almost like pain. The particular pain of seeing a consequence you tried not to see made physical. No, Frank said quietly. I didn't believe it. And the motorcycle, Marcus said. The motorcycle. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Thomas had told me he was documenting everything, that he had put the documentation somewhere safe. I didn't know where. After he died, I realized it had to be in the engine. I'd watched him work on it. I knew the level of craft he put into every piece of it. I knew if he'd hidden something, it would be in the machine itself. He paused. So I started making sure no one could finish it. Small things. A wrong component here. A subtle misdirection there. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would make anyone suspicious. Just enough to keep every mechanic who came in from getting deep enough into the third system. For 20 years, Marcus said. For 20 years, Frank said. The room around them had the quality of something that has been holding its breath for a very long time and has only just been allowed to release it. Nobody said anything. The members around the edges of the garage were processing something that was not just the revelation about Frank, but everything underneath it. The 20 years of believing Thomas had simply died and left them an unsolvable mystery. The accumulated grief of every failed restoration attempt. The friendship between two men that had ended in the worst possible way. Caleb was looking at Frank with an expression he hadn't planned on and couldn't fully control. He had expected walking into this moment to feel something clean, righteous anger maybe, or the satisfaction of a truth being forced into the light. What he actually felt was more complicated and less comfortable than either of those things. He was looking at a man who had made a terrible choice in a desperate moment and then spent 20 years inside the consequences of that choice. And the face that fear and guilt had built on Frank Miller over 20 years was not the face of a villain. It was the face of someone who had tried to hold too many things together and had broken something that couldn't be repaired and had spent every year since then knowing it. Caleb had been broken by people who left him and didn't explain why. He understood more than he was comfortable with what it looked like to carry something that was too heavy and too old to put down. Frank, he said. Frank looked at him. Did you know he had a son? Caleb asked. Something crossed Frank's face, a shift so immediate and so complete that it was almost like watching a man age in real time. He told me, Frank said, when we were close in the early years. He told me he had left a woman and a small boy behind. He said it was the worst thing he had ever done. He said he told himself he would go back when he had something to offer them, when he was stable, when he had the right words. He paused. He kept not going back. And then he was too ashamed of having not gone back to go back, and the shame compounded on itself, and every year the wall between him and his son got higher. He kept saying he was going to go, Caleb said. He kept saying, Frank confirmed, every year. He'd talk about it more around your birthday, I think. He kept track of when your birthday was. He stopped. He seemed to catch himself saying something that was more than he'd intended to say. He talked about what you'd be like, what kind of person you'd have grown into. Caleb said nothing. I was proud of you, Frank said, and his voice was rough now. Rough in the way voices go rough when the throat is fighting something. For surviving, for not becoming bitter. He said someone had told him a little about how you were doing that. You were living hard, but you were working. You were always working. You were good with engines even as a boy, and you'd never stopped. He said that was from him, that whatever else he failed to give you, he gave you that. The garage was very quiet. Caleb looked at the Harley. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the silence was not awkward, but simply the space a person needs when they are standing at the intersection of something enormous and something personal. His father had known, had been watching from a distance the way a man watches something he's afraid to walk toward, gathering information about the life of the person he'd abandoned and carrying it alone because he had no right to carry it openly. The motorcycle made sudden complete sense in a way it hadn't quite made before, even knowing what was inside it. It wasn't just a confession, it was a 20-year attempt to build something worthy enough to justify coming back. And he had never made it in time. Marcus, Caleb said, his voice came out steady. He was holding it steady with both hands internally, but it came out steady. What happens now with Frank? Marcus had been sitting very still on a stool during the exchange between Caleb and Frank. And he had the look of a man who has been watching two separate things happen simultaneously and processing both with equal difficulty. He shifted his weight now and looked at Frank directly. That depends, Marcus said. On some things that aren't mine alone to decide, there are processes. There are obligations to the broader organization. He paused. And there are obligations to the truth, which I think we all understand are not negotiable. Frank nodded. He was not arguing. Whatever fight he might once have had in him on this subject had apparently ended sometime during the 2 minutes that Thomas Walker's engine sang. I'll cooperate with whatever the organization requires, Frank said. I've been ready to for a long time. I just couldn't find the mechanism, couldn't find a way in that felt survivable. He looked at Caleb one more time. I didn't expect this to be how it happened. Neither did I, Caleb said. A moment stretched between them, not comfortable, not resolved, but not hostile either. The moment between two people who have been brought into contact by circumstances, neither of them controlled, and have discovered that the person on the other side of the damage is a person, which is sometimes the most complicated thing there is to discover. There's something else, Caleb said. He reached into the pocket of his work jacket and withdrew the second sealed tube from the exhaust chamber, the list with the dates and amounts and names. He had kept it from the group during the confrontation with Frank, wanting to hear Frank's account, first wanting to know how much Frank was willing to volunteer, before knowing how much had been documented. He held it out to Marcus. Marcus took it and unrolled it. He read it. His jaw tightened once briefly, and then the discipline reasserted itself. Is this complete? He asked Frank. Frank looked at the list from across the space between them. He couldn't read it from there, but he seemed to know what it contained. It's complete for what Thomas knew, Frank said. Thomas documented everything he'd been able to find out. He was thorough, he always was. Something that might have been in different circumstances, the remnant of affection moved across Frank's face. He was thorough about everything. Marcus rolled the list back up. He held it carefully, the way you hold something that is both evidence and history. Raymond, Marcus said. Raymond straightened. Get me a secure line, tonight. Marcus stood up from the stool. He looked around the room at the members who had heard everything, at Frank, who was still seated on the workbench, at Caleb, who was standing beside Thomas Walker's completed motorcycle. What happened in this room tonight? Marcus said, addressing the chapter. Stays in this room until I've made the appropriate calls. That's not a request. He let that sit for a moment. What Thomas built and what this young man finished tonight will be handled with the respect it deserves. Frank will be handled according to our obligations. And the family of Thomas Walker. He stopped and looked at Caleb. The family of Thomas Walker will be part of whatever comes next. Several members were looking at Caleb with expressions that had shifted significantly from where they'd been 18 hours ago, when he'd walked in with a dented toolbox and no credentials. The shift was not simply respect for mechanical skill, though that was part of it. It was the recognition of something that had happened in front of them that transcended the mechanical. A son finding his father's last words inside a machine he'd followed home by sound, and choosing to finish the work rather than walk away from it. Frank stood up from the workbench. He looked at Marcus. Can I say something? Frank said. Marcus nodded. Frank turned to face the room. He stood straight, which seemed to cost him something, not physically, but in the way it costs someone to stand fully upright in front of people they've wronged. "I've been sitting in this chapter for 20 years, Frank said, carrying something that I should have set down a long time ago. And I told myself every year that there wasn't a way through it that didn't destroy everything. But the truth is," he stopped, he reset. "The truth is that I was afraid, and fear makes people do things that they spend the rest of their lives not being able to explain to themselves." He paused. "That's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as an excuse. I'm just Thomas would have wanted me to say it plainly. So that's what I'm doing." The room received this without visible response, faces controlled bodies, still. Not forgiveness, not condemnation. The careful silence of people waiting to know what they think. Marcus said nothing. He had said what he needed to say, and the rest would unfold in the days and weeks in organizational processes ahead. What tonight was the beginning of an accounting that had been delayed 20 years. Caleb turned back to the Harley. He put his hand on the tank, not the diagnostic touch of a mechanic, but the simple contact of a person with an object that means something to them beyond its function. His father had sat in this garage and built this machine and hidden inside it everything he couldn't say out loud, and then died with the message undelivered, believing it would stay hidden forever or not long enough to matter. He had been wrong about the second part. Caleb stood there for a long moment, his hand on the tank, and let himself feel what he had been too busy to feel. Through the 18 hours of work, the grief and the anger, and the complicated tenderness of loving someone you never knew, which is its own specific kind of loss, different from losing someone you knew and loved, because it carries the permanent uncertainty of what might have been different if things had been different. His father had been brilliant. His father had been flawed. His father had loved him from a distance with a love that was real, but also too afraid of itself to become what it should have been. He could hold all three of those things at once. He had been holding things at once his whole life. Raymond appeared at his shoulder, not crowding him, just present. "You should sleep," Raymond said quietly. "I know," Caleb said. "There's a room in the back. Thomas used to sleep there when he worked late." Caleb looked at him. "I know," Raymond said. He said it gently. "But it's a bed, and you've been awake for how long now?" "I don't know," Caleb said honestly. "Sleep," Raymond said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." Caleb looked at the Harley one more time. Completed. Running. The sound of it still lived in his chest the way music lives in the chest after it ends. Not as memory, but as physical sensation. The body having absorbed something it won't easily release. He followed Raymond to the back room. He lay down on the narrow cot in the room where his father used to sleep when the work kept him through the night. He was asleep in under 2 minutes. And in the main garage, the Harley sat in the center of the floor, and the members of the Austin chapter moved quietly around it and spoke to each other in low voices. And Marcus Bennett stood alone with the rolled paper in his hand and the phone to his ear, beginning the conversation that 20 years of a buried truth had made necessary. Outside, the first gray light of a Texas morning was coming up on the horizon. And Frank Miller sat on the steps of the warehouse and looked at the sky and breathed the way a man breathes when something very heavy has finally, after a very long time, been set down. Caleb slept for 4 hours and woke up knowing exactly where he was. That was unusual. In the years of moving from place to place, from abandoned garage to borrowed floor to truck, cab to whatever shelter the next town offered, he had developed the habit of waking disoriented, that half second of blankness before the brain assembled the current location from available evidence. It was a survival mechanism, really. You couldn't afford to assume you were somewhere safe just because you had fallen asleep somewhere safe. But this morning he woke up and knew immediately. The smell of the room oil and metal and old wood, and something underneath all of it that he could not name, but that his body had apparently cataloged while he slept. He lay still for a moment and let himself know where he was. His father's room, his father's cot, his father's walls, his father's smell still somehow present in the grain of the wood after 20 years. He sat up. Through the wall, he could hear voices low, the particular register of people talking seriously about something, and the sound of movement in the main garage tools being set down and picked up the creak of the floor under boots. The chapter was awake. Whatever Marcus had set in motion with his phone calls the night before was already developing. Caleb stood up, found the small washroom adjacent to the room, splashed water on his face, looked at himself in the mirror for a moment, with the neutral assessment of a man checking an instrument, rather than examining himself, and went out into the garage. The Harley was exactly where he had left it. He stopped when he saw it the way he had stopped when he first saw it, but differently now. The first time had been the recognition of a machine in pain. This time was the recognition of something completed, something that had reached the state it was always meant to reach. It sat in the center of the floor with the particular stillness of a thing that has said what it needed to say and is now simply resting in the aftermath. Marcus was at the far end of the garage on the phone, turned slightly away from the room. His posture, the contained tension of a man managing a complex situation with very few words. Raymond was near the workbench with two other members, and all three of them looked up when Caleb came in. "Coffee," Raymond said, and held out a mug before Caleb had taken 3 steps. "Black, I figured." "Yeah," Caleb said and took it. "Marcus has been on calls since before I woke up," Raymond said quietly. "National organization, some other parties I don't know. He hasn't told us the full picture yet." Caleb drank the coffee and looked at Marcus's back. Even from across the room, even seeing only the back of the man, he could read the weight of what was being carried. The posture of a man who has spent the night learning that the map of something he thought he understood was wrong and is now navigating by a different map without enough time to fully study it. "Where's Frank?" Caleb asked. Raymond hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "He didn't leave," Raymond said. "He's in the parking area. He's been there since early morning, just sitting." Caleb looked at the side door. "Don't," Raymond said. "I'm not going to do anything." "I know you're not going to do anything. I'm saying don't go out there, because Marcus asked us to let Frank sit until he's done with his calls. Whatever comes next for Frank needs to come in the right order." Caleb looked at Raymond. "What do you think comes next for Frank?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who answered questions carelessly. He assembled the answer, first checked it against what he actually believed, then delivered it. "I think Frank has been waiting for this for 20 years, Raymond said. "I don't think he'll fight it. I think he's too tired to fight it." He paused. "What's harder is what it means for the rest of us, for the chapter. 20 years of a thing happening inside your walls that you didn't see. That's not something you process quickly." "No," Caleb agreed. Marcus ended his call and turned around. He looked tired in a way that went past the surface of a sleepless night into something that had been building for longer than one night. But his eyes were clear and purposeful, and when he walked toward Caleb, his stride was decisive. "Sit down," Marcus said. They sat, Marcus, Caleb, Raymond, at the workbench, the coffee between them, like a small domestic anchor in the middle of something large. "I've spoken to the national organization," Marcus said, "and to 2 individuals who have some interest in the information Thomas documented." He did not elaborate on who those individuals were, and Caleb did not ask. "The situation with Frank is going to be handled at a level above this chapter. That process starts today." "Okay," Caleb said. "Frank has already agreed to cooperate. He agreed this morning before I made the first call. He came to me at 6 and said he was ready to give a full account of everything." Marcus's jaw tightened briefly. 20 years. And he came to me at 6 in the morning and said he was ready. "He heard the motorcycle," Caleb said. Marcus looked at him. "Whatever he couldn't face before last night," Caleb said. "Hearing it changed something. I think he needed to hear it. I think he'd been waiting to hear it the same way everyone else had been waiting, and when he finally did." He stopped. "My father knew him. He knew that if the engine ever sang, Frank wouldn't be able to keep carrying it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Thomas knew him very well," he said, "and there was grief in it, and something else, the complicated remainder of a friendship that had been real before it was broken. The grief not just for Thomas, but for Frank, for the version of Frank that had existed before the fear and the bad choice and the 20 years of compounded consequence." "What happens to the motorcycle?" Caleb asked. Marcus looked at the Harley. "That's partly why I wanted to talk to you this morning," he said. "Thomas built it. You completed it. The question of what belongs to whom is..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "It's not simple." "I don't want ownership of the motorcycle," Caleb said. Marcus looked at him. "I'm not asking you to..." "I know you're not. I'm telling you preemptively because I can see where the conversation is going and I want to get there faster." Caleb set down his coffee. "Thomas Walker built that motorcycle for this chapter. He built it as his masterpiece, as his legacy, as his gift to the people who gave him a home when he had nothing. The fact that he also hid a message inside it for me doesn't change what the machine itself was meant to be." He paused. "I finished it. That was what I was supposed to do. The motorcycle belongs here. Marcus studied him for a long moment. You're 22 years old, he said for the second time since they'd met. You keep saying that, Caleb said. Because I keep being surprised by it, Marcus said. There was something in his voice that was as close to warmth as his voice apparently got, not soft, not sentimental, but genuine. Raymond was watching Caleb with an expression that had settled into something that was not quite fatherly and not quite fraternal, but existed in the territory between them, the way some relationships do when they form quickly under pressure and skip the ordinary stages of development. There's something else I need to talk to you about, Marcus said. He picked up his coffee, turned it in his hands, once set it back down. The note Thomas left, the personal one, not the documentation, the one addressed to you. Caleb nodded. There's a line in it I didn't mention last night, Marcus said. When I read it the first time in front of everyone, I skipped a section, deliberately, because it wasn't for the room. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. What did it say? Marcus reached into his jacket and produced the note, the original, which Caleb had handed to him, and which he had apparently kept on his person since the moment he received it. He unfolded it carefully, found the section he meant, and read it aloud. He wrote, "There is money. I have been saving for 18 years with the intention of going back and giving my son a start, something to build on something I failed to give him by being present. I was too afraid to deliver it in person, so I am leaving it here with the people I trust. If Caleb finds this, give it to him. If he never comes, use it for someone young who needs it. But tell him I knew he was going to be something. I knew it from the start. The way he listened to engines before he could even speak in full sentences. He heard things nobody else could hear. I always believed that gift would take him somewhere. I just wanted to be there to see it, and I was too much of a coward to make that happen. I'm sorry. That's the only thing I know to say that's worth saying." Marcus stopped reading. The garage was quiet. Caleb looked at the workbench surface in front of him. He looked at the grain of it, the old oil stains, the marks left by decades of tools being set down and picked up. He focused on these because focusing on small physical things was what he did when the alternative was falling apart in front of people, and falling apart in front of people was not something he was going to do. He breathed in slowly, out slowly. "How much?" he said. His voice came out almost normal. $43,000, Marcus said, in an account he set up 20 years ago and added to every year. He kept the details with Raymond sealed with instructions to give it to his son if his son ever found the motorcycle. Marcus paused. "Raymond has the account information." Raymond nodded once, confirming, and in his expression was something that looked like relief, the relief of a man who has been holding something in trust for a very long time and has finally been able to deliver it to the right person. Caleb sat with $43,000 and an apology written in his dead father's hand and the sound of an engine that had been designed to bring him home. And he sat with all of it for a long, quiet moment, and then he said something that surprised him slightly. "It's enough," he said. Not about the money. The money was extraordinary, and he knew exactly what it meant for a man who had been sleeping in truck cabs and working for $40, knew what that number represented in terms of possibility and forward motion, and the difference between surviving and building something. But that wasn't what he meant. "I was paying attention," Caleb said. "All that time. He was watching from wherever he was, and he was paying attention, and he was ashamed of himself, and he was trying to fix something he knew he couldn't fully fix." He paused. "That's not enough. I'm not going to pretend it's enough. He should have come back. He should have tried. He stopped, reset. But it's something. It's real. It's not nothing." Marcus looked at him with the particular expression of a man who recognizes a level of emotional sophistication in someone younger than himself and doesn't know whether to be impressed or quietly devastated by the circumstances that produced it. "No," Marcus said, "it's not nothing." The side door opened and Raymond tensed slightly, but it was just one of the younger members coming in from outside. He looked at Marcus. "Frank's asking," the young man said. "He wants to know if he can come in." Marcus looked at Caleb. That surprised Caleb, the deference of it. This was Marcus Bennett's chapter, Marcus Bennett's garage, Marcus Bennett's decision in every practical sense. But the look said clearly that on this specific question, the decision belonged to someone else. Caleb thought about it. "I thought about Frank Miller, sitting outside in the early morning, sitting with 20 years of a choice he couldn't undo, waiting to find out what came next. He thought about what his father had written the word sorry in capital letters twice, as if the second time might reach somewhere the first time hadn't. He thought about Thomas Walker, who had been brilliant and flawed and afraid and loving and too paralyzed by all of those things simultaneously to do the one simple thing that would have mattered most. I thought about the way fear compounded, the way a bad decision made from fear became 10 bad decisions made from the fear of the first one, and then 20 until what had started as one terrible moment in someone's life had become the architecture of everything that came after. He understood something about that. Yeah, Caleb said. Let him in. Frankie came in from the parking area and stood just inside the side door for a moment, the posture of a man who is not sure how much space he has the right to occupy. The gray morning light had done something to his face, or maybe the night had, or the hearing of the engine, or the 6 in the morning conversation with Marcus, when he'd finally said the thing he had been holding for 20 years. He looked smaller than he had the night before. Not physically, but in the way a person looks when they are no longer performing something. He looked at Caleb. Thank you, Frank said, for letting me back in. Sit down, Caleb said. Frank came and sat at the workbench, leaving one empty stool between himself and Caleb. Not across the table, not at a confrontational distance, but not presuming closeness either. Somewhere in the middle, which seemed about right for where they actually were. I want to ask you something, Caleb said. Okay, Frank said. The accident, Caleb said. Thomas's death. You said you didn't know it was going to happen, but you believed afterward that it wasn't natural. Frank nodded. His jaw was tight. Did you ever try to find out for certain? Frank was quiet for the moment. When he answered, his voice was rougher than it had been. I was afraid of what finding out would mean, Frank said. Because if I found out it was deliberate, if I found out that Thomas was killed because of information I provided to people who then decided Thomas knew too much, then it was my fault. Directly, not indirectly, not the consequence of a bad decision. My fault. He paused. So I didn't look too hard, and I told myself it was because there was nothing to find. But the truth is, I didn't look too hard because I couldn't survive what I might find. But you knew, Caleb said. I knew, Frank said. The way you know some things when you can't make yourself look directly at them. From the corner of your eye. Caleb leaned forward. The people who approached you, the ones who asked for information, are they still active? Frank and Marcus exchanged a look. That's part of what I've been on calls about this morning, Marcus said carefully. The documentation Thomas left, it's 20 years old, but the organizations involved don't dissolve on their own. Some of what's in those papers is still relevant to current situations. He paused. Which is why certain parties are very interested in cooperating with us on this. Is Caleb in any danger? Raymond said. He said it directly, the way Raymond said most things without softening. Marcus looked at Raymond, then at Caleb. I don't believe so. The people Thomas documented don't know he had a son, and they don't know a son walked into this garage yesterday morning and found a 20-year-old sealed tube inside an exhaust pipe. He paused. I intend to keep it that way until the situation is handled at a level where it doesn't matter what they know. Caleb absorbed this. It was a strange thing, discovering that your dead father's greatest work had detonated into something that extended far past the personal, that the grief and the reunion and the mechanical miracle of a completed engine were accompanied by real-world consequences, moving in the background like weather. The human story and the operational story running simultaneously, and Marcus navigating both with the competence of a man who had been navigating complex terrain for decades. Frank, Caleb said. Frank looked at him. My father, in the years you were friends, before everything. What was he actually like? Not the mechanic, not the legend. What was he like as a person? Frank looked at him for a long moment, and in his expression was something that was grief in its simplest form, the grief of someone who had loved someone and lost them, and then spent 20 years unable to speak about that love honestly because of what they had done. How was funny, Frank said. People don't usually know that. The legend version of Thomas Walker is all genius and intensity. But he was funny. He had this very dry sense of humor, the kind that took you a second to catch. And when you did catch it, he'd already moved on, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to make people laugh. He paused. He was the kind of person who noticed things, small things. If you came in wearing a look that meant something was wrong, he'd notice before you said a word, and he'd come by your workbench an hour later with coffee, and he'd just sit with you. not asking questions, just sitting. Frank's voice had gone quiet. He was the best friend I ever had, and I destroyed it, and then I destroyed him. The last sentence was very simple and very terrible, and Frank said it without drama, the way you say things that have been true for so long. They've lost their ability to shock you and have become simply the fixed coordinates of your life. Nobody tried to contradict it because it was true, and Frank had spent 20 years knowing it was true, and something about this morning in this room and the presence of Thomas Walker's son seemed to have brought Frank to a place where the truth was the only currency he had left, and he was going to spend it fully. He would have forgiven you, Caleb said. Frank looked at him sharply. Not immediately, Caleb said. He would have been furious. He would have said everything that needed to be said. But eventually he would have found a way to it. He paused. He wrote that he was carrying things he couldn't talk about. He spent 18 years too ashamed to go back to his own son. He understood what it meant to do something you couldn't undo and have to live inside it anyway. Frank's composure cracked. Not dramatically a small fracture, the kind that is harder to watch than a clean break, because it shows exactly how much effort has been going into holding the structure together. He put his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he brought it down and sat up straight. Thank you, he said, for that. I'm not forgiving you, Caleb said clearly. That's not mine to give. I barely knew what he looked like until I found his handwriting on a wall. But I know enough about carrying guilt to know that you being crushed under it forever doesn't fix anything that's broken. He paused. What fixes things is what you do next. Frank nodded slowly. Cooperate fully, Caleb said. Tell them everything, not to save yourself. Tell them everything because it's the only thing left that's worth doing. Frank looked at Marcus. I already told him, Marcus said quietly. Same thing. A moment passed between the three of them, Marcus and Frank, who had known each other for decades, and Caleb, who had known both of them for less than 24 hours. It should have been awkward. It was not awkward. Certain moments of real seriousness produce their own social grammar, and the grammar of this moment was clear to everyone in it. Raymond, who had been silent for several minutes, cleared his throat. There's something else, he said and looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at him. Say it. The chapter voted this morning while you were on calls, Raymond paused, about the motorcycle and about Caleb. Caleb looked up. The motorcycle stays, Raymond said. That was unanimous. It rides, it doesn't sit. Thomas built it to be ridden, and that's what it's going to do. He paused. And the chapter voted also unanimous that Caleb Walker is welcome here, not as a mechanic for hire, as, he stopped, seemed to search for the right word, as someone who belongs here, if he wants. The garage was very quiet. Caleb looked at Raymond. He looked at Marcus, who was watching him with an expression that was not pressuring, but was an open door. The look of a man indicating a direction without insisting on it. He looked at the Harley. I thought about the truck 2 miles down the road that had $37 in the glove compartment, in a bag of beef jerky, in a life built entirely on motion, on the next place, on the philosophy that nowhere was the right place to stop, because stopping meant asking questions about why you were stopping there and not somewhere else, which meant answering questions about whether somewhere was a home, which meant confronting the fact that you had never had one. I thought about a man who had spent the last years of his life building an engine that sang and hiding inside it, an apology and a sum of money, and the admission that he had always known his son would find it. The right person will find it. He'll know what to listen for. I need a few days, Caleb said, to think about it. Take whatever you need, Marcus said. But first, Caleb said, I need to do something. He stood up from the workbench. He looked at the Harley. I need to ride it. A beat of silence. Then Raymond stood up. Yeah, Raymond said. You do. Marcus stood, and then in ones and twos, the other members who were in the garage stood not dramatically, not as a choreographed moment, but with the organic unanimity of people responding to something real. Frank stood last slowly, and when he was standing, he looked at the Harley with an expression that was grief and relief and something that might very distantly have been the first edge of peace. Caleb walked to the motorcycle. He stood beside it for a moment. He put his hand on the engine, that familiar diagnostic contact, but there was nothing diagnostic about it now. He was not listening for what was wrong. He was touching the work his father had done, the craft of a man. He had never sat across a table from the evidence of a mind that worked the way his own mind worked, with the same frequencies, the same instincts, the same particular kind of listening that most people couldn't do, and that both of them had apparently been doing since before they were old enough to understand it as a gift. He climbed on. He turned the key. The engine caught and ran and settled into the purr that was the resting state of something that had been completed. The full song was in it contained, for now available, waiting for the throttle and the road to release it. He could feel the vibration through the tank, through the handlebars, through the seat, and it was his father's hands he felt in the vibration. 20 years of intention translated into mechanical reality. He rode out of the garage into the Texas morning. The road was long and flat, and the air at this hour had the particular freshness that only exists in the moment before the heat asserts itself. And when Caleb opened the throttle on Thomas Walker's completed masterpiece, the engine sang the way it was always meant to sing, full and rich and musical and impossible, moving through his chest and his hands and the road beneath him and the air around him. The song of a thing that had been waiting for this exact moment for 20 years. And rode for 20 minutes. He did not think. He did not plan. He did not analyze. He let the road and the engine and the morning do what they did, which was the same thing the best music does: fill all the space that grief and complication usually occupy with something that is not an answer to those things, but is large enough to exist alongside them. When he came back to the garage, the members who had gathered outside were quiet when the sound of the engine reached them. They stood and listened to the Harley coming back down the dirt road, and the sound it made on the approach was the same sound it would make forever now. Whole finished the instrument Thomas Walker had spent his final years designing to say what he could not say in words. Caleb came through the gate and stopped in the parking area and cut the engine. He sat on the motorcycle for a moment in the silence after the engine stopped. Marcus walked over and stood beside him. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Marcus said, "Well." Caleb looked at the garage. He looked at the group of men who had come out to listen to the return of something they had waited 20 years to hear. He looked at Raymond, who was standing with his arms crossed and his eyes slightly wet and was not making any particular effort to hide it. He looked at Frank, who stood slightly apart from the group, but had not gone back inside and had listened to the engine return with an expression that was the most openly human thing Caleb had seen on his face. He looked at the Harley beneath him, his father's work completed. "I'm going to need a place to set up a shop," Caleb said. Marcus looked at him. Something shifted in his face, controlled but unmistakable. "We've got space," Marcus said. "I'll need equipment," Caleb said. "Real equipment, not what's in the dented toolbox." "We can work that out," Marcus said. "And I'm going to want to work on my own terms," Caleb said. "I'm not joining anything formally. I need you to understand that I'm not here because I need something to belong to. I'm here because this is where my father was, and this is where his work is, and this is the closest thing to him I'm ever going to get." He paused. "And because the people in this building heard him when nobody else was listening, and that matters to me." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Thomas would have said the same thing," he said. "Almost word for word." He paused. "He came here with nothing and told us he worked on his own terms. He said he wasn't joining anything formally. He said he just needed a place." Marcus looked at the garage. "He stayed 17 years. Caleb looked at him. "Yeah," Caleb said. He climbed off the motorcycle. He picked up his dented red toolbox from where he'd left it near the garage entrance, felt the familiar weight of it in his hand, the weight that had been his constant through every mile and every town and every engine that other people had given up on. He carried it back into the garage. He set it down next to the workbench that had been Thomas Walker's, and began very quietly to unpack it. The toolbox made a sound when Caleb set it down on Thomas Walker's workbench, a solid particular sound, the sound of metal on wood that has absorbed decades of the same contact. And that sound did something to the room that nobody commented on, but everyone felt. It was a small sound. It carried an enormous weight. Raymond watched him unpack without speaking. The other members drifted back inside one by one, following some collective instinct that the morning had moved into a new phase, and the new phase required presence. Marcus stood near the garage entrance with his phone in his hand and his attention split between the calls he still needed to make and the young man methodically laying out instruments on the bench that had been his father's. And the split showed on his face in a way that Marcus's face rarely showed anything. Caleb unpacked the toolbox the way he always unpacked it, in the specific order he had developed over years. Each instrument placed in its designated position relative to the others, the system of it, so ingrained that his hands moved through it without conscious direction. It was a grounding ritual, though he had never called it that. It was simply the thing he did when he arrived somewhere new. The act of making the workspace his, of saying with the arrangement of tools that he was here and he was working, and the work was what mattered. But this morning, the ritual meant something different. He placed the last instrument and stepped back and looked at the bench, and for the first time in his life, the workspace he had made felt like it was in the right place. "You're going to stare at it or use it," Raymond said from behind him. "Both," Caleb said. Raymond made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. He came to stand beside Caleb at the bench, looking at the spread of instruments, the way a person looks at a language they don't speak but have learned to respect. "Thomas had twice as many tools," Raymond said. "He collected them, couldn't walk past a pawn shop or an estate sale without coming out with something he didn't have. By the end, this bench was so full you couldn't find anything." A pause. "We kept them. Everything he left. They're in the storage room in the back." Caleb looked at Raymond. "I'll show you later," Raymond said, "when you're ready." Caleb nodded and turned back to the bench and picked up the first thing that needed doing, because that was always the answer to the things that felt too large to hold you. Picked up the first thing that needed doing and you did it, and then you picked up the next, and the work built a structure around you that was stable when the other things weren't. The first thing that needed doing was also the thing Marcus had been circling since Caleb unpacked the toolbox, the thing the chapter needed and hadn't said directly yet. Caleb had seen it in the peripheral conversations, in the way the members looked at the other bikes along the walls, in the way Raymond had mentioned Thomas's tools, the way you mentioned something you've been hoping to bring up. There was other work here. There was always other work. By mid-morning, Caleb had assessed 2 bikes that members had been waiting on, one with an ignition problem that had been diagnosed wrong 3 times and was actually a fuel pressure issue sitting upstream of where everyone had been looking, and one with its transmission problem that was more straightforward, but had been quoted at a figure by an outside shop that made Raymond shake his head when Caleb gave him the actual assessment. "How did you—" Raymond started on the second bike. "The sound," Caleb said. "The gear engagement has a particular resonance when the tolerances are off. You can hear it if you know what you're listening for." Raymond looked at him for a moment. "Thomas used to say the same thing." "I know," Caleb said. He hadn't meant to say it that simply, but it came out that way. Not with grief or drama, just as a plain fact. The acknowledgement of an inheritance he was still in the process of understanding the full dimensions of. Raymond didn't push it. He was good at that, knowing when to stay alongside something and when to give it room. By noon, Marcus had finished his calls and came to find Caleb at the workbench. "The situation with Frank is moving faster than I expected," Marcus said. "The parties involved are motivated to resolve this quickly. Frank has been cooperative beyond what anyone required. He spent 3 hours this morning with people I brought in, and he told them everything. Not just what Thomas documented. Everything going back to the beginning." Caleb set down the instrument in his hand. "What does that mean for him?" "It means," Marcus said carefully, "that the picture is more complicated than even the documentation suggested. Frank was not the only person involved. He was the entry point, but what operated behind him was larger. Thomas, in documenting what he knew, had only seen part of it." He paused. "The part Frank has been able to add fills in the gaps. And Frank personally." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "There will be consequences he has to face, inside the organization and outside it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He looked toward the side door through which Frank was not visible, but whose presence somewhere nearby was still felt. But Frank walked into that conversation this morning, and he didn't negotiate. He didn't ask for anything in exchange. He sat down and he started at the beginning and he went all the way to the end. Marcus paused. "That's not nothing." "No," Caleb said, "it's not nothing." It was what he had said about his father's money and his father's apology, and Marcus recognized it, and the look that passed between them acknowledged the echo without requiring comment. "There's something else," Marcus said. He reached into his jacket and produced a phone, scrolled to something, and handed it to Caleb. Caleb looked at the screen. It was a news item local Austin area published that morning. The headline was about the resolution of a long-standing investigation into an organized crime network with connections to several criminal organizations operating in the Southwest. It was vague in the way law enforcement news items are vague when things are still in motion, but the date was today, and the language described an operation that had been assisted by new documentary evidence and the cooperation of a key witness. Caleb handed the phone back. That was fast, he said. The evidence Thomas preserved was significant, Marcus said. 20 years old, but corroborated by Frank's account of what happened since. And the people who received it have been building a case for some time. Thomas's documentation was the piece they were missing. He put the phone back in his jacket. Your father, in the last months of his life, sealed inside an engine the information that's now in the process of dismantling something that's operated for 2 decades. He paused. He didn't know it would take this long to be found, but he built it to last. Caleb looked at the Harley, which sat where it had been sitting since the night before completed, ridden once resting. I thought about a man sitting in a back room at 4 in the morning, writing a letter to a son he had abandoned, hiding it inside the most precise and difficult piece of work he had ever done, building an engine designed to sing for the person it was made for. Building something so specific, so tuned to one particular set of ears that it had survived 20 years of sabotage and professional failure and institutional doubt and one bad man's determined interference, and had still eventually made the sound that needed to be heard by the person who needed to hear it. How was extraordinary, Caleb said. He said it simply without qualification. Yes, Marcus said, he was. They stood for a moment side by side, the 58-year-old chapter leader and the 22-year-old runaway mechanic beside the motorcycle that connected them, and the morning moved around them. Then Marcus said, "There's someone here to see you." Caleb looked at him. "She arrived about 20 minutes ago," Marcus said. "I asked her to wait. I thought you needed to eat something and finish the second bike before." He stopped. "She said she'd wait as long as it took." "Who?" Caleb said. And even as he said it, he felt something move through him that was not quite premonition but was adjacent to it, the body's knowledge arriving slightly ahead of the mind's. "She said her name is Margaret," Marcus said. "She said you'd know who that is." Caleb did know who that was. Margaret was his mother's name. He stood very still for a moment, long enough that Raymond, who had been pretending to work on something nearby and doing a poor job of the pretense, looked over with an expression that was carefully neutral but watching. "Where is she?" Caleb said. "Parking area," Marcus said. "She drove from New Mexico. She said she left at 4 this morning." Caleb thought about his mother, who had given him a faded photograph when he was 16 and told him she didn't want to keep it anymore, who had not been cruel about it, who had been so exhausted by the weight of a man who left and never explained himself, that she had handed the last evidence of him to her son and asked him to carry it forward because she no longer could. He thought about what she must have felt when she got the call. I didn't know who had called her. He hadn't thought to call her himself, hadn't thought it through, hadn't understood yet that what had happened here was not just his own private reunion with a father's ghost, but a piece of history that belonged to her too, that she had been carrying her own version of it for 22 years. He walked out to the parking area. She was standing next to a car that had a lot of miles on it, and she looked the way people look when they have been driving since 4 in the morning, on not enough sleep and a great deal of emotion, and have arrived somewhere. They're not sure they should have come, but couldn't make themselves not come. She was in her mid-40s, and she had Caleb's jaw, and Caleb's way of standing, the feet planted solidly, the weight distributed, like someone who has learned not to be knocked over easily. She looked at him. He looked at her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. The conversation of two people who know each other completely and haven't seen each other in 2 years and have something enormous between them that neither of them has found the words for yet. "Someone called me," Margaret said. "A man named Marcus." He said. She stopped. She collected herself with the visible effort of a woman who has been collecting herself since 4 this morning. "He said you found your father." "I found his work," Caleb said. "In his words." She nodded. Her jaw was tight. "Mom," Caleb said. She crossed the space between them and put her arms around him, and he let himself be held the way he had not let himself be held since he was small. And she was not a tall woman, but she was solid, and she held on with the particular tenacity of someone holding something they're afraid of losing. And he put his arms around her and held back, and they stood there in the parking area of a Hells Angels garage in Austin, Texas, in the middle of a morning that had already held more than any single morning had a right to hold. When she stepped back, her eyes were wet, but her face was steady. "Tell me," she said. So he told her. He told her all of it, the sound from 2 miles out that had pulled him from sleep. Marcus at the gate, the 3-day deadline, the hand on the engine, the secondary circuit, and his father's name scratched into metal. The back room with the handwriting on every wall, The notes that were technical and the note that was personal. The sealed tube in the exhaust chamber, the list, with Frank's name at the top, and the money saved for 18 years for a son Thomas Walker had been too afraid to return to. He told her about the engine singing. He told her about Frank sitting on the steps at dawn with the look of a man who had finally set something down. He told her what his father had written about her, not in the note, because the note had been for Caleb, but in the technical journals on the walls in the margins, where Thomas had occasionally written things that were not technical at all, the small notations of a man thinking out loud in the only private space he had. There were mentions of her in those margins, not by name, but phrases that were unmistakably about her, references to something he had broken, that he understood he had broken and could not repair from the outside. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting. That was something Caleb had always respected about her. She could receive difficult information without reflexively processing it aloud, without filling the space it occupied with her own response before she'd actually finished taking it in. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He was watching, she said, all that time. Yes, Caleb said. He could have come back, she said. It was not an accusation exactly, but it wasn't not that either. It was the statement of someone who has the right to name the thing plainly. He could have, Caleb said. He didn't, and I think we both have to hold those two things at the same time and decide what we do with them. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, recognizing her own phrases in his mouth, measuring the man her son had become against the boy she'd last seen, feeling something that was relief and grief in equal proportion. When did you get so old? She said. I was always old, Caleb said. She almost smiled. You were, even as a baby. You had this look like you were assessing everything. She paused. Your father had that look. I could see it in you, and I didn't know whether to be glad of it or not. Both, Caleb said. Both, she agreed. They went inside together, and Marcus met them at the door with the particular courtesy of a man who understood the gravity of what he was facilitating and wanted to get the mechanics of it right. He found Margaret a chair and coffee and gave her the space to look around the garage at the walls and the bikes and the Harley at the center of the floor, and Caleb watched her looking and let her take the time she needed. She stood up and walked to the Harley after a few minutes. She stood beside it, the way Caleb had stood beside it that first time, the time of stopping, and she put her hand on the engine the same way he had put his hand on the engine, which was not something he had told her about, but which she apparently arrived at by the same instinct. Start it, she said. Marcus looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded. Raymond climbed on the Harley and turned the key, and the engine caught and ran and found itself, and the three-system harmony resolved into the full sustained note. Thomas Walker's completed masterpiece, filling the garage the way it had filled it the night before, moving through the chest of everyone present. Margaret stood beside the engine with her hand on the casing and her eyes closed. She stayed that way for the full 2 minutes. When Raymond cut the engine and the sound faded, she opened her eyes. She looked at her hand on the casing. She looked at the engine. She looked at the room. That's him, she said quietly. That's exactly him. Nobody asked what she meant. Everyone in the room who had known Thomas Walker understood immediately, and Caleb, who had never known him, understood through her. She took her hand off the engine and straightened up and turned around, and her face had the look of a woman who has received something she had long ago stopped expecting to receive and is still in the early stages of knowing what to do with it. What happens now, she said, to Caleb, but to the room as well. Caleb's going to set up a shop here, Raymond said, before Caleb could answer, and said it with the confidence of someone who had decided this was settled. Margaret looked at Caleb. Is that right? She said. I'm thinking about it, Caleb said. He unpacked his toolbox, Raymond said, on Thomas's bench. Margaret looked at Raymond. Something passed between them. Two people who had just met, connected by a person neither of them had known, in the same way recognizing in each other a shared stake in what came next. Then it's settled, Margaret said. I said I was thinking, Caleb started. You unpacked your toolbox, his mother said. Caleb, you've been carrying that toolbox since you were 17 years old, and in all that time I have never once seen you unpack it without knowing you were going to stay. She paused. You don't unpack your toolbox to think about it. Caleb looked at the bench, at the instruments laid out in their specific order, the order he had developed over years, in the position that meant he was here and he was working. He looked at the Harley, at his father's work completed. He looked at Raymond, who was very carefully not grinning. He looked at Marcus, who was watching him with the expression of a man watching something arrive at its destination, the particular satisfaction of a long delivery completed. He looked at his mother, who was looking at him with the expression that she had been looking at him with since he was 4 years old. The look that said she saw exactly who he was, the whole complicated true shape of him, and had never once flinched from it. "Yeah, okay," Caleb said. "It's settled." The word settled moved through the room in a way that was different from any other word that had been spoken in it over the past 24 hours. All the other words, the confrontations, the confessions, the revelations, the grief, the accounting of 20 years of buried truth, had been words of motion of things being dislodged and moved and examined and set down. This word was different. This word was foundation. In the weeks that followed, things happened fast and slow simultaneously, the way significant change always operates on two timescales at once. The surface moving rapidly and the deeper structure shifting slowly, both necessary, neither sufficient, alone. The formal process with Frank moved quickly. Within 10 days of the morning, Frank sat down with Marcus's contacts and began talking the operational picture that Thomas Walker had begun documenting 20 years ago, had been substantially completed by Frank's account, and the parties involved had what they needed to move forward. Frank faced consequences that were real and serious, and he faced them without argument or negotiation the way he had promised. Marcus told Caleb about 3 weeks in that Frank had requested to speak to Caleb directly, not to ask for anything he had specified, just to say something he needed to say. Caleb agreed to the meeting. They sat in the back room, his father's room, just the two of them, and Frank said what he had come to say, which was simpler and more direct than Caleb had expected. "I want you to know," Frank said, "that in the year before Thomas died, when he found out what I'd done and confronted me, he told me something. He said the only way through a thing like this was to stop making it about survival and start making it about truth. He said that's what he was trying to do with the motorcycle. He said he was building the truth in metal because he didn't know how to carry it in words anymore." Frank paused. "I didn't understand that then. I do now." Caleb looked at him. "He was right," Caleb said. "I know," Frank said. "I just needed to tell you he said it. Because he said it before I let what happened happen, and I want you to know he was already moving toward the right thing before the end. He was already trying." Caleb thought about that for a moment, about his father at 49, 6 months before his death, telling his closest friend that the only way through was truth, building the documentation, writing the notes, designing the third system that would say what he couldn't say in person. Trying, as Frank said, not making it, but trying. "Thank you for telling me," Caleb said. They shook hands when Frank left. Not easily, not without the weight of everything between them, but genuinely the handshake of two people who have decided that what they share is more useful than what divides them, and who are willing to build on that slowly and carefully. The shop came together over the following month. Marcus and Raymond and 2 other members helped him move equipment into the space adjacent to the main garage, a proper shop with the tools inherited from Thomas Walker, supplementing and in many cases surpassing the contents of the dented red toolbox. The first time Caleb laid out both sets of tools on the same bench, his own instruments alongside his father's, and looked at the combined spread, he stood still for a long time. Raymond inevitably was there. "What?" Raymond said. "He had the same calibration marks," Caleb said. He was holding one of his father's vibration sensors, looking at the small marks he'd made on the casing to indicate calibrated settings. "Same system, same positions." He looked at Raymond. "I developed this on my own. I've never seen anyone else use it." Raymond looked at the sensor. He looked at the marks. He looked at Caleb. "You want me to say something profound about that?" Raymond said. "No," Caleb said. "Good," Raymond said, "because I don't have anything." Caleb set the sensor down in its position on the bench. "Neither do I," he said. "I just wanted to tell someone." "I heard you," Raymond said. The shop opened in the second month, not with ceremony, not with announcement, not with anything that would have been premature, given how recently all of it had changed. It opened the way things open when they were ready, which is to say, one morning, Caleb was there and working, and there were 2 bikes that needed serious attention, and by the end of the day, both had been assessed, and one had been started on, and that was the opening. Word moved the way. Word moves in communities built on a specific kind of loyalty, not through advertising or publicity, but through the particular network of people who know. People who know people, all of whom share the common thread of caring deeply about machines and being very unforgiving of work that doesn't meet the highest standard. A man came in from San Antonio, 6 weeks after the shop opened, pulling a bike that had been turned away by 3 separate shops, who told him the engine problem wasn't fixable without a factory replacement. Caleb had it diagnosed in 40 minutes and repaired in 3 days. The man stood in the garage when he picked it up and listened to the engine run and made a sound that was not quite speech. How, he said. The frequency breaks at a specific point in the mid-range, Caleb said. If you know what you're listening for, you can hear where the damage is before you start taking things apart. The man looked at him. How long have you been doing this? All my life, Caleb said, which was true and was also the simplest possible version of a story that had taken 5 parts to tell. His mother came back in the 3rd month. She had gone home to New Mexico to settle things, her job, her apartment, the ordinary logistics of a life that was about to change. And she came back with 2 suitcases and the pragmatic efficiency of a woman who had made a decision and was executing it. You're moving here, Caleb said. I'm moving near here, Margaret said. I'm not moving into a Hells Angels garage. I found an apartment 15 minutes away. I'm not in the Hells Angels garage, Caleb said. You're in the adjacent building, Margaret said, which in terms of my comfort level is meaningfully different, but only barely. Marcus, who was within hearing range, made no comment. But when Margaret left that day to go arrange the apartment, he looked at Caleb with an expression that contained something that was almost humor. She's going to be fine here, Marcus said. She's going to terrify everyone here, Caleb said. Same thing, Marcus said. 6 months after Caleb Walker walked through a chain link opening, following a sound most people couldn't hear, the motorcycle that Thomas Walker built, and Caleb Walker completed, rode in a gathering that brought together chapters from across the Southwest. It was not a competition. It was not a performance. It was the kind of event these communities hold to affirm what they are to each other, riders and machines, and the particular freedom that exists when both are exactly what they're supposed to be. Marcus rode the Harley. He had asked Caleb, first offered it with a formality that was not ceremony but respect, and Caleb had said no, without hesitation, not because he didn't want to ride it, but because he understood that the right person for that particular ride in that particular gathering was the man who had kept faith with Thomas Walker's machine for 20 years and had never fully let go of the belief that it could be finished. Marcus deserved to ride it into that gathering. Caleb watched from the sideline. He heard the engine before he saw the motorcycle, that distinctive, impossible musical note that Thomas Walker had engineered out of pure mechanical imagination, and he watched the faces of the people around him as the sound reached them. The way they stopped moving, the way conversations died mid-sentence, the way people turned without fully understanding why, following the sound, the way Caleb had followed it down a dirt road in the Texas July heat. Because that was what Thomas Walker had built. Something that stopped people. Something that made them listen. Beside Caleb, Raymond said nothing, which was the right response. After the gathering, when the Harley was back in the garage and Marcus had come down from whatever a man comes down from after riding, then Caleb went to his workbench and sat for a while in the quiet of the shop. The instruments were laid out in their positions. The work of the day was done. The evening was coming in through the high windows. He picked up the vibration sensor with his father's calibration marks on it and held it for a moment. I thought about a 4-year-old boy sitting in a garage while his father worked, pressing his small hand against engines too large for him to understand, and feeling the mechanical heartbeat translate through metal and skin and into something his brain cataloged automatically. He thought about the years between then and now, the hard years, the moving years, the years of not knowing where he came from and having to decide in the absence of that knowledge who he was going to be. I thought about a dirt road and a sound and a chain link fence and a man who told him he had 3 days. I thought about the engine singing. He put the sensor down. He looked at the shop around him, his bench, his father's tools integrated with his own, the work that was here today and the work that would come tomorrow, the bikes along the walls and the high windows and the garage next door where Thomas Walker's masterpiece rested. He thought about the note on the wall in his father's handwriting. The right person will find it. He'll know what to listen for. He had known. He had always known. It was the only gift his father had managed to give him in time delivered, not in person, but in the particular frequency of a broken engine, crying out across 2 miles of Texas road in the middle of the night, and it had been enough. It had been against all probability and reason and the weight of 20 years of a buried truth exactly enough to bring him here. The runaway mechanic who had spent his whole life following the sound of broken things had followed one final sound to the only place that was ever going to make sense. He was home, and the road that had taken him everywhere had not been running away from something after all. It had been leading him the whole time straight back to where he belonged.